Great.
So I want to welcome everyone. This is very exciting. This is my first virtual tasting that I've ever done. We're fortunate to have Phil Minissale here representing M&H Whisky Distillery, which is the first of its kind from Tel Aviv, kind of a young, hip distillery that opened in Tel Aviv, and they've been working with world-renowned people. And Phil is promoting this product and a broker for this product here in America, in this region, and he's going to tell us all about this fabulous whiskey and gin, and hopefully you have a bottle of it next to you that you can taste along.
Yeah, thank you so much for putting this together. This is really fun. You've managed to not do one of these yet. I mean,
not a tasting.
You're right. There we go. I've been doing this now since like the second week of the quarantine, and it's been, it's fun. It's a great activity. People get to learn. Hopefully, if everything is organized, we're able to get everyone sipping on a product. Again, if you didn't get a chance to get a bottle, this is a great opportunity to get enticed to purchase a bottle, and we will make sure it's easier for you moving forward. This is a brand new brand to the U.S. It's only been in the market for a couple months, and it's really exciting, and I love the opportunity to share a little bit about what M&H is doing. So M&H stands for Milk and Honey, Land of Milk and Honey. I'm assuming some folks have been to Israel, have maybe visited Tel Aviv. I unfortunately have been, but it was prior to the existence of this distillery, so I didn't have the chance to walk through and taste the whiskeys while I was there. But I do plan to go back when it's safe to do so. So a little bit about me: I work as a broker. That's basically I connect a distributor to a supplier. The supplier is M&H Distillery. I help them find a distribution home in the southern markets. So Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas. I do some in Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, where there's an interest for a unique craft spirit like this. So my job is to work with the import team to introduce Milk and Honey to folks that really dig whiskey. And this is a single malt whiskey. So if you know that terminology, that means not only is it comes from 100% barley or whatever malt that it is going to be coming from a single distillery. So that's a common mistake that people make in understanding the language of a single malt. So there's blended that might be 100% barley whiskeys, but you can't call that a single malt whiskey. So anytime you see the language, it comes from a single distillery space. So that's an important thing to remember. They are the first of its kind in Israel making single malt whiskeys. And what sets them apart is on the technical side of what this is doing. Also, if you do have a bottle, it doesn't hurt to pour a little bit in your glass. I'm going to do so because it does help, it helps the vibe. It gets the aromatics out there, gets you like really excited to taste it. I've been busy with my bottle, as you can tell. So don't mind me. I'm just gonna let it permeate my spot here. Okay, so you'll see on the left hand right there. I mentioned this earlier. If you weren't on the call, what separates them is where they're sourcing the barley. It's not a common place. It's a big beer. Obviously, for beer, this type of barley is very, very common. They'll use this is a 2-row barley, which is common for a lot of beers outside of a 6-row barley. This is going to be an unpeated barley as well, so that's an important thing to remember because you can source your barley already peated to make your whiskeys. So what they'll do is they'll use a process to peat at the distillery space so they can influence their whiskey at the distillery and don't have to worry about getting a variety of different types of peated barleys. That language, ppm, is parts per million. That's a very common acronym in the whiskey making world. So when it says 40 ppm, that's 40 parts per million. And if you are big fans of peated whiskey, think of like a distillery like Lagavulin or Lafroig. Those guys are peated around 45 to 55 ppm. So this is, you know, not this particular whiskey, this classic, but other types of releases that they have are going to be peated. And do we know what that peat is? It's like basically like rotted seaweed, all the stuff that comes up on the beachheads in Scotland that they burn, they dig up, they burn it, they fire it in the kiln, and it dries the barley, and it influences the flavor and that smoky, funky character into the barley before they start to do the wash of the barley. So next to there, you'll see a mashing tun. So when we talk about whiskey in the Scottish tradition, this means that they're following the same metrics to produce a whiskey. They're starting with the barley, they're germinating the barley, they're peating the barley perhaps if they're making peated whiskeys. Then they're going to mash it, basically turning it into a little grist. So they're taking all the starches that come from germinating the barley, which would be malted versus unmalted barley. So they're taking that malted barley, they're grinding it up into what's called grist. They're throwing it into this mash tun. They're adding a bunch of water, and then they're letting a initial fermentation start. So the 450 tons a year basically shows the capacity of what M&H Distillery is able to accomplish. Obviously, it's not there quite yet. It's still a growing distillery, but they want the consumer to know that we are totally capable of meeting your demands as a whiskey distillery, even though we're located in small Israel in Tel Aviv. They have the capacity and the production capability to produce a lot of whiskey. So down below, the next step, you'll see the 4 stainless steel washbacks. That's where it's just going to go, it's going to get the fermentation. They're going to pitch a yeast in there. A yeast's job is just to eat all of the sugars and to create more alcohol. So it's showing up to 60 to 72 hours of that fermentation. So it's really, that's the point of the process that really makes the whiskey special. It's going to bring out like all of your fruity aromas, your funky characters before it goes into the distillation process. So in the Scottish tradition, like I said before, am I going too fast? We're doing good?
We're doing good.
Okay. In the Scottish tradition, the job is to then take all of that wash. Once it gets to an appropriate ABV, alcohol by volume, then they go into what's called the wash still, which is the first of the large still. And that its job is just to get like the low wines is the language that they'll use. That's basically getting your base alcohol before you go into the refined still, which is the spirit still. So if you move, I got to move my like little thing over here to the, so if you go, you'll see the second distillation is a much smaller still. So you're at 9,000 liter still, the wash still, which is going to yield right around, traditionally it's around 35% alcohol, 40% alcohol at most. And then it goes into the second distillation. And in the first still, you wouldn't want to drink that. That still has a lot of congeners, stuff that you don't want to drink in your alcohol. But you do get an idea of what the spirit still is going to do. So that's a refinement still. It's usually, the language is usually a finishing still. So that second still, out the still, what they call in the whiskey thief, is going to be your finished new make product. It's not necessarily whiskey at that point. It's just a new make grain alcohol or a barley alcohol. Then it will go into the barrels, and once it's in the barrels for a period of time, then you can start to use the language of Israel's first single malt whiskey. The maturation, I'll get into this on the next slide, but this is where whiskey in Israel, it becomes very, very special. I mean, for a lot of reasons, but it has a lot to do with the climate in Israel. It has a lot to do with what changes from night to day, the level of humidity, the heat, the temperature changes, the fluctuations. And if we know Israel well, it's got so many different, it's kind of like Peru. It's got like so many different feels to it. You go up into the Golan Heights and you get into the Negev Desert and you get to the Dead Sea, and it's just, there's so many different like climates that are in such a small place. So it shows the diversity of what the whiskey can do in Israel. Last, it's showing you how many liters of spirit into how many casks are capable of being filled annually. So that with the rick house that's there, basically the warehouse that allows them to store the barrels, we have 800 casks that we can fill annually. And when you think about a cask, if you fill a cask at 2 years or 3 years, it's going to be a different amount of bottles if you were to bottle in 5 years or 7 years, because of the amount of alcohol that you use, that you lose just to what's called the angel share. So basically oxygen getting into the barrel, and you're typically losing in, let me go to the next slide here. I'll get into this in a second of the core ranges, but I wanted to kind of talk a bit about why this is so special. When you think about the humidity most of the year with where they're aging the barrels, you're looking at 50 to 90% humidity. That's Celsius there. So for those that are good at your Celsius, it gets very hot. 40 degrees Celsius is pretty hot, and you get a lot of sunshine. So the influence that will have on the barrel, when you think about moisture and humidity, you think about what happens. It expands with heat, and then it contracts when it cools, right? So the whiskey inside the barrel is consistently moving in and out and infusing its way into the oak and then pushing its way back out as it gets cooler. And this happens on a daily basis. So what M&H Distillery is able to do by simply emulating processes that have been done in Scotland for hundreds of years, they now are taking that technology and they're simply putting the barrels in a new environment. So in Scotland, and even in the United States, when you look at the bourbon industry, Scotland and Kentucky typically have the same amount of angel share annually. And it's an average, it all depends on the year, but it can be somewhere between 2.5 and 4% of annual. So when you think about how much whiskey that barrel is losing, say it's a bourbon barrel, that's 255 gallons, you're losing 2.5 to 4% of that annually. That's why you can see bourbons at 20 years, at 25 years. So this is where it's a shock. Milk and honey will lose 10% annually. So you're looking at sometimes 3 times to, depends on where it's at, but at most you're losing 3 times the amount of whiskey annually. So where you can see a bourbon that is aged for 30 years or a Scotch whiskey that's aged for 30 years, which is really exciting and expensive. You can't see M&H Distillery aging probably past 10 years, simply because there's going to be nothing left in the barrel. And another distillery that has a common climate and influence the whiskeys in the same way is this distillery. If you're big into world whiskeys, this is a distillery that's from Bangalore, India. This is Amrut. So Amrut will have the same 10%, and it has a lot to do with the elevation and the climate, the humidity, the constant fluctuation of temperature. They'll lose their alcohol at 10%. And they release a whiskey that's about 8 or 9 years old, and they name that whiskey Greedy Angels, because the angel share is what we describe as taking our whiskey away, right? So Greedy Angels is how they name it, and they might only release maybe 15 or 20 bottles per barrel. because that's really all that they can yield from a barrel that's been sitting around in the warehouse for 10 years. So I wouldn't be surprised that in, say, 2024, when they first, as of 10 years, in 2014, they opened the distillery, started putting whiskey up in the barrel. I wouldn't be surprised in a few years or 5 years, they have a special release that is an older release that's very limited, probably also quite expensive, but just showing you what is able to be done and how whiskey gets more and more complex as it ages in the barrel. So the common misconception about whiskey is the older the better. I believe it's proven to be wrong. Some people think that the deeper the color, the also more complex the whiskey can be. In my opinion, sometimes the deeper the color, the more one-dimensional that whiskey can be, because it's so focused in the amount of time with the influence of what is influencing that barrel that you lose some of the complexity and the nuances of what makes that whiskey unique from other ones. If it has too much time in the barrel, it's just going to take on that complexity, that flavor profile of the barrel. So when I am talking about M&H Distillery, we have to take into consideration that this is a young whiskey, but it also is in a place in the world where old whiskey is not possible. It's never going to be something that could happen because of how quickly it evaporates inside the barrel. So if you saw above, we're looking at our core range. So M&H Classic, this guy is going to be in an ex-bourbon barrel. They're also going to use what's called STR. STR stands for shave, toasted, and recharred. It's becoming more popular to use that terminology in the whiskey world, because it used to be known as dechar, rechar, and that language was primarily a way of salvaging old barrels, and it just didn't sound as good as shaved, toasted, and recharred. So it's common to see on some whiskey packages that are coming out that will communicate STR, and know that when it says that, basically they're rejuvenating an old barrel, which is really exciting because they shave out all the old stuff. They then will toast it and then put the whiskey right back into it. So it revives, and when they toast it and then rechar it, the toast brings out what's left of the remnants. Might be the old booze that lived inside it. It could be wine that's just deep inside the barrel, and the heat pulls it to the surface again, and then you burn it and char it and caramelize the inside of that barrel. So you're getting some really cool, unique flavor from an STR cask. STR wine, ex-Islay. If you know Scotch whiskeys, Islay is the place notorious for the peated whiskeys. Like I mentioned before, Lagavulin, Laphroaig, Ardbeg. I got a couple back here. Kilholman is another one. Israeli red wine, that's going to be one of the newest Element releases that'll come out. That's coming down the pipe. And ex-sherry, which is the Elements series. And in special editions, this is something that they release over in Israel at the Tasting Room in Tel Aviv, but we will have some of these that'll become available to us as well. Pomegranate wine cask will be a special edition that'll make its way to us, and we'll most likely see the Israeli white wine port style and the Israeli port style. The other stuff they're just getting from an Israeli rum producer or a local craft Israeli brewery, and that there's not enough of that to make its way here, unfortunately. So let's see. I was mentioning this before. This describes it much better. 5 climate zones. You're looking at, that's kilometers. These guys were feet and meters. I hope this doesn't, confuse anyone too much, but it's showing the highest elevations to the lowest elevations, the Dead Sea being the lowest elevation there. And what's special about this is they're actually doing these experiments where they're taking their barrels and they're storing their barrels in different areas with different climates and different elevations throughout Israel. You can do that in a day's drive. with a couple barrels in the back of your truck. But currently, they have some really fun projects happening at the Dead Sea. They partnered with a building there that let them lease up the top of the roof there. So they have barrels that are exposed to the elements at the Dead Sea. And I was told the last time Tal and Tomer, the distillers of M&H, went there, they calculated that they're losing 25% annually every year. So I imagine they're going to remove those barrels, I hope, in the next year, or there won't be much of it left available. Okay, so did we get like a show of hands of who ended up grabbing a bottle and having a bottle? Awesome. We got some people there. I'm seeing some hands. All right. Well, great. You poured yourself a little dram there. There we go. You're all set up, ready to go. Great. So I poured a little bit as well. So this is the classic. This is going to be the core expression. So when I say core expression for any type of distillery, these are going to be the most readily available expressions that come from the distillery. So not special releases, things that they're able to replicate and produce on a regular basis. So from the core expressions, we have M&H Classic, we have Elements Sherry, we have Elements Peated. These are the three products. Oh, and of course we have the gin as well as a core expression. So if you got a little whiskey, I like to get in there with my nose first. And one thing I noticed right away on this particular release is you get a lot of nuttiness on it. There's some fruit and like some stone fruit quality about it, but I get like a lot of nuttiness that comes from it. You're also going to get a little bit of that oaky character that'll come from the particular casks that are used for the classic. So get in there and take a little sip. A common flavor. If someone wants to tell us what they're tasting, you can unmute yourself really quick and chime in here. I'd love to hear some feedback. Not all at once now. Okay, I'm just going to keep talking. So
I can say, so
please, thank you.
I'm not as sophisticated with you in knowing what I'm smelling, but I do know that when I opened the bottle and I poured a bit about 20 minutes ago,
sure,
it's very aromatic.
Absolutely.
And so that's the first thing that I really noticed compared to some other whiskeys. And it's for me, it was a very pleasant and inviting aromatic smell, not off-putting in the least. And the taste is very smooth, has a nice finish, no burn.
That's great. It also plays a factor. It can also play a factor of how long you let that sit in your glass prior to sipping. So, you know, as I mentioned before, I poured my whiskey, you know, early on before, because I did want it, you know, room to open up, you know, let it breathe a little bit, just like you would a glass of wine, let the oxygen get to it. That is a common practice in tasting whiskey. Smelling it out of the bottle versus smelling it out of the glass after 10 minutes will maybe bring a significant difference. You're going to get less of that astringency on the nose than you would. For one thing, you're opening up the space in which the oxygen can get to it versus the small space that's in the glass. So nosing a bottle like this versus nosing it in a wide glass will play a significant factor in how that is being influenced by you. So there's a lot of vanilla. There's a lot of light oak as well. I'm glad you said that it was smooth to you. There is a component of young whiskey that M&H is. You're looking at whiskeys that are aged no more than 3 years. So the classic is when you think about misconception about age statement and how important that is to us as consumers, that this kind of turns that on its head, because you can see the complexity that a whiskey from Tel Aviv, simply because of its location, can play in the finish of this particular whiskey. So, and if you go back in for another taste, the palate, so typically you're looking at nose, palate, finish. These are the three things you talk about with whiskey. So get the aroma from the nose. You want to get how it feels on your mouth. Is it viscous? Is it heavy bodied? Is it kind of just quick to the back? Is it evaporating right away on your tongue? Typically, if that's the case, it's a very boozy whiskey versus something that is cut to, I think the sweet spot is 45 or 46%. And our import team typically releases every single core expression at 46%. That's just how we like it. There are whiskeys M&H whiskeys that are available in other markets, and the importers, say in the UK, might prefer whiskeys at 40% or 43%. So it gives you the ability to taste a whiskey, I think, unadulterated, not as much as it would be in the UK or another market that doesn't like whiskey to be super boozy. I always say you can add a drop of water or two, and then you can get it to the dilution that you want. That also will open up a little bit more character to the whiskey as well. And then lastly, in terms of tasting, you think about the finish. So the palate, is it kind of viscous? Is it light? Is it giving you like a lot of sweetness, some tartness maybe on some spirits? Maybe you're getting some spice, like some black pepper. Is it hurt? Does it kind of sting your tongue a little bit? And then the finish, is it quick or is it sustaining? Does it hang around for a minute? Is it short? Is it delicate? Is it long and robust? Like, how does this one make you feel? I find that it lingers a little bit, but actually it doesn't hang out for very long, which is nice because it keeps you drinking and going back for more, which is obviously how I ended up in my state with my bottle. So it doesn't hang around too much, which is nice because some whiskeys can give you a little bit of a bitterness that isn't pleasant, and that could come from the influence of the oak. The oak will impart a lot of that bitterness if it's heavily oaked. So if the barrel is charred really, really heavily, you're gonna get a little bit more of a bitter finish than you would. But this is beautifully balanced. They're doing an amazing job creating whiskeys. And to dive a little bit into how M&H became part of this portfolio is the importer that I contract with is called Impex Beverages. And Impex is a renowned world whiskey supplier to the US and Canada. They have been working for 20 years introducing new world whiskeys. So Kilholman is one of theirs, and there's a Welsh whiskey, if you've heard of this, Welsh whiskey from Wales called Pandaren. That's another product of theirs. And I'm simply mentioning these because they're connected to Milk and Honey in one way. They all consulted with a gentleman that was named Jim Swan. He was like a genius when it came to not just understanding what whiskey was about and what he thought whiskey should taste, but he took what the distillery had, basically the materials, the stills, whatever they were using, and then he worked with the distillers on finding the best results from the equipment they were using. He didn't go in there and say, you need to get rid of this, you need to get rid of that, you need to get rid of your master blender, you need to do this, you need to do that. He worked within what the distillery presented to him, and he found the outcome that worked best for the distillery. So for Pandaren, for example, they use a unique still. It's the only one in the world. It puts out whiskey in a single distillation run at a very high proof, but it's very fruity. And he basically said, let's experiment. Let's source a whole bunch of barrels from a bunch of different places, and let's just put this whiskey in every single one of these barrels and we're going to taste, and we're going to determine what your core expression is. And for a distillery to not make their core expression an ex-bourbon expression is very, very uncommon because of the accessibility to ex-bourbon. Does anyone know why ex-bourbon barrels are so readily available? Feel free to unmute, and it's a little quiz question. Why do you think ex-bourbon barrels are so readily available? Anybody? Let's go.
The world drinks a lot of bourbon.
Yeah, where are our bourbon drinkers at? Oh, we're all world whiskey drinkers. Okay, so ex-bourbon barrels are so readily available because in order to call it bourbon, you can only use it one time. So you're using a virgin oak barrel. Basically, they're coopering. A lot of U.S. distilleries have coopers on site that will make the barrels. They char the barrels. They fill the barrels with whiskey. It needs to sit for a minimum of 2 years in order for it to be called bourbon or whiskey in the U.S. And then that barrel essentially needs to be retired. So a lot of barrel brokers, similar to like what I do with spirits, there's a guy that basically acquires all of these bourbon barrels, and then he goes to world markets and he sells retired ex-bourbon barrels that might have had whiskey in it for 2 years. It might have had whiskey in it for 5, 10, 15. It all depends where he sourced the barrels. So it's a very common practice for a lot of these distilleries to release whiskeys in an ex-bourbon expression. So what separated Pandaren is this guy Jim said, it tastes the best in Madeira wine casks. Let's source as many Madeira wine casks as we can, and that'll be your core expression. And that's just the beauty of what he was able to do. He worked at Catalan Distillery as well. He worked with Kilchoman in finding that their core expression was not just an ex-bourbon, but it was a nice blend of ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. And finding the right balance between the two was how it came to be. So one of the last projects that Jim Swan worked on was M&H Distillery, helping Tal and Tomer find the sweet spot with the equipment that they were using, with the barrels that they were sourcing, and creating the finished product that I think is a remarkable spirit to be introduced to the world whiskey. Let's see. All right, I kind of went into this a little bit, but I kind of touched on some of this stuff. Like I said, nose, palate, finish. There's some stuff in there. I also get like, I get like a nutty note. The floral complexity is also in there as well. That's a common nose on fairly young whiskeys because of the esters that are in the distillation process. And that's just characteristics that you get from the fermentation of the alcohol. Too much esters is going to be really funky, and it's going to be like a wild product. Like if you have a very high estery, what's called new make whiskey, and you throw it into 3 barrels right next to each other, they might taste like night and day next to each other after a couple of years. So finding a nice balance with your esters will also create a more level consistency with your finished whiskey. So let's see here. All right, going into the elements a little bit. So we've got one of the elements that was released to the market. We have peated cask. We're going to have a wine cask. That's going to kind of vary, like I showed you on the previous slide. We'll have a pomegranate wine cask. We'll have a white wine cask and Israeli red wine cask. And those will go into those STR, shaved, toasted, and recharred barrels. Let's go into the sherry. And this is cool because it really hones in on what separates M&H Distillery, for that it being being a kosher distillery as well. Of course, to sell in Israel, they probably would have made a mistake to not make it a kosher distillery. So they went above and beyond to ensure that every release that they were putting out into the market is guaranteed a kosher release. And it's not the easiest process to find, say, a producer that is making sherry kosher. So they'll actually use a network of rabbi. There's rabbis in Jerez, and there's rabbis in where they make the Olorosa sherries, where essentially a rabbi needs to be a part of the production process and ensuring, of course, that this remains kosher from the beginning to the end. They can't just say, hey, you made sherry, here's the blessing, this is now a kosher sherry. The rule is that the rabbi needs to be present for the production. So he's actually getting in there and making the wine and making the sherry with the people in Spain to ensure that when it leaves Spain, it is a 100% kosher sherry, arrives at the distillery. Every production process at the distillery is kosher, including the days, that they work, the days that they're making whiskey. Everything falls into the rules. So they can ensure that this is the only one of its kind in the world. There are other kosher whiskeys out there, but this is the only kosher sherry cask finished whiskey available in the world. So if you got a bottle, that's pretty special. Sorry if you didn't have a chance, but there's product out there. We'll get you a bottle. We'll make it happen. So one thing I noticed right away, are there any sherry drinkers? Thumbs up. Yes, I like sherry. It's a pretty unique fortified wine. It has a lot of character. I like to cook with it, but I also like to just drink it too. So one thing you'll notice right away, the color's deeper on the sherry cask. The sherry itself will influence a lot of the color. I think it can bring a little bit of more viscosity. I don't know how well you can see the glass, but you'll also see what are called like the legs. This is just kind of the level of density of the spirit, the viscosity. So you can see kind of the oils. There's always going to be a little bit of that oily nature that'll be in a lot of these whiskeys. A lot more fruit character on the nose. Let's see if I can bring up some notes on the sherry. So aroma's pretty consistent to a sherry cask finished whiskey. You are getting like a little bit of that oak character that was present in the classic, but it has a little bit more of a citrus freshness, I think. And of course, like red fruit notes, you can get like cherry character. I also find that sherry cask whiskeys can remind me of sounds like a bad descriptor, but like a hay quality about it. Almost like after a rains at the farm, like a wet hay character. If you ever, hung out at the farm after a rainstorm. That's what I'm smelling, people. Okay. Okay, and palate for me, there's a touch more body to it. I think it's common to also feel like this whiskey is a touch stronger than the classic. It's a little bit more biting, but it's just more robust. It's got more body. It's got a lot more sweetness than the classic as well. And you're going to get a little bit more of a finish. So whereas the classic kind of was a subtle finish, you get a nice long finish. You get some chocolatey notes that are in there as well, like a chocolate covered fruit, and almost like a tobacco-y quality about it as well. So that is the two lines of whiskeys that we have available. Classic. Elements is gonna, like I said, we're gonna release a whole bunch of these coming to the US in the coming months. I think the next one is gonna be the pomegranate cask and maybe the Israeli red wine cask. Those will come into the market next. I love this guy's just cooking his dinner right here. Kind of, I'm like, oh man, that looks good. Let's get into it. All right, so did anyone grab a bottle of the gin by chance? I'm going to talk about it just briefly, because it's special. So gin, this is another, thing that separates them. They wanted to produce a whiskey, but they also wanted to introduce another category of spirit, because when you think about a gin, it's a little bit more widely accepted than world whiskeys. So if I'm going to come into the market and introduce M&H, I might not necessarily get a bar to pick up a bottle of the single malt quite yet, because they want to see how it's going to perform. They want to see the buzz, what people are talking about it. Whereas a gin, they're going to use this in a cocktail quite a bit more. They're very familiar with gins and the influence it makes in their drinks. We love gins in New Orleans, so we can make like a Tel Aviv gin fizz now, boom, with Levantine gin. And what does separate it? You're looking at a lot of gins are going to be, say, you've got grape-based gins, you've got just grain-based gins. This will come from the new make whiskey itself. So they're taking the character of the whiskey and they're then making introducing the botanicals that make this gin special. So if you're big into Israeli cuisine, you'll notice that one of the spices there is very, very common. That's never been introduced to a gin at the capacity that it has. So if you're turned off by gin, it might be because of the botanical nature. Like it might be simply the juniper. And in order to be classified as a gin through the TTB, which is the governing body that kind of regulates alcohol in the US, the recipe requires that a percentage of it needs to be a juniper berry. So no gin in the world can completely not have juniper in it. It has to be in it in some capacity, but there are some that use it to the minimum. There are some that use it to the maximum. This particular gin uses it to the minimum. So I really like this one. It's a great introductory gin because it has a little bit more of it's not as completely piney that you get on a lot of gins. It has more of a citrus sweet note. It's got a lot of reminds me of chamomile a little bit, and that tatar will give it a nice little spice. And also it's got a nice salinity, which I think plays into where it comes from as well. I mean, Tel Aviv, you're right there. You're gonna get some salinity that will impart itself, not just into the whiskeys, but also into the gin itself. All right, well, maybe I'll unshare the screen here if I know how to do that right. Let's see.
Should be at the top of your screen.
Is it? Okay. I know I gotta move my bar here. Okay, yes, stop share. Cool, there we go. So there are some cocktails that you can also make with these if you are looking to get adventurous with your bottles. I like to just sip these whiskeys, but I do like to fool around with the gin and make some fun stuff. But the classic, it's still possible to make some good cocktails. You can kind of play on all of your classics. But I do have a cocktail book. If anyone is interested, what I can do is you have everyone's email that was on because
Yes.
they gave it to you. What I'll do is I'll upload the cocktail book. That way I'm not diving into it too much and you can just share it with the group.
Happily. I will do that tomorrow.
Great. It's in milliliters. So just know that 30 ml is 1 ounce. So when you think about how the proportions are, 30 ml is 1 ounce, then of course 10 ml is going to be a third of an ounce and so on and so forth. So just do the math. It's there. And they're delicious cocktails and they use some really fun stuff in it. So did anyone have any questions about M&H that I didn't cover?
There was one question in the chat regarding
Ooh.
bourbon casks.
Yes.
Is he
Let's
still?
see. You know which bourbon yes, so they are going to be like Sazerac casks. They're going to be like a Buffalo Trace barrel.
That's what I figured, and it was interesting with the Buffalo Trace just coming out with the kosher line. I didn't know if there was any connection there to that.
Not that I'm aware of. I don't work with the brokerage, the barrel brokerage that sells to them. They'll have a separate broker that will do that. But yeah, I noticed that was interesting as well from and that there's a demand for that for like a kosher line of barrels and whiskeys that are coming from distilleries. Let me see. I have my chat open here. I do see. Can you tour the facility? Yes, you can. They do really amazing master classes there now. They just reopened the distillery to do some socially distanced classes. So they're selling out quite fast. There aren't as many seats available per class, but you get to do the class with the team at M&H. Most likely it's going to be either Tal or Tomer, the two guys that make the whiskey, and they're like our salespeople for M&H. Does anyone else have any questions? Or any notes and thoughts about the whiskey? Did you enjoy it? Do you enjoy this whiskey? Yes. Good.
Thumbs up.
Good. And go ahead.
Is this going to be in stock in all our local stores now, or are we going to have to jump around again?
So
Ilios has it, brother.
I wish I could say, like it's going to be in every package store, every bottle shop in New Orleans. That may not be the case. Typically, these will land in those types of independent bottle shops. This won't be a bottle that will land at Rouse's anytime soon or a larger store. But if we go to our places like Ilios, Brady's, Martin's, Keife, the folks down in the Marigny there, Grand Cru, these are the types of folks that obviously will be interested in carrying a unique whiskey like Milk and Honey.
And one thing that we were discussing before it started was due to the pandemic, the bars aren't open, so the bartenders aren't trying the whiskeys and the gin and promoting it and building up an interest. So right now during the pandemic, it's probably harder to find because there's less demand, because there's less knowledge since it's so new. Absolutely.
That's the main obstacle I've had to overcome in this whole thing for my business is, sure, I know that people want the products, they want to try them, but all my avenues for people to try them are just not there. My bartenders become my advocates for all the things I represent. So I get them to buy a bottle, then they pour a dealer's choice, or you ask them, hey, like, what's new? I want to try something fun and exciting, which I often do at the bar. They will pour me something, and that's what I'm looking for at the liquor store. So if you don't see it on the shelf there, you can take a photo, go to the website, take a screen grab, and go into that shop and say, hey, listen, I learned a lot about this whiskey. I really want a bottle and I want to buy it from you. I want to support you. So do me a favor and pick this up so I can buy this bottle from you. That's my advice. Yes, I see a hand is up.
I just want to add to that. So Ilios does have it, and they seem to have some more than just 2 bottles. And also Martin's is more than happy to order it for you.
Sure.
At this stage, we've gone to all these places and checked it out. That's what we found.
They ran around town for all of us.
That's right. We were doing community service work. Cheers.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I would love to do this again. If there's any interest in learning about other world whiskeys, Rachel, I'd love any opportunity to maybe do like a little series once a month where we explore, another whiskey or another spirit from another place in the world. And when we plan for that, we'll make sure that we have a particular package store partner, and I'll make sure they get some samples over there, and we get the product stocked on the shelves.
I think it should be Elio's. They are the good supporter. They
Yeah.
be the best neighborhood.
I will give some props to Keife. I went over there. They didn't have it, but within an hour they texted saying they just got some more in. So
All right.
they were very helpful. But speaking of supporting, how is there a way that we might engage you outside of JCC with other organizations that we're a part of, even big groups of friends? Because this is pretty fun.
This is a fun thing to do.
Absolutely. I'd love to do that. Early on during the pandemic, I was describing, like, I basically put a big schedule, and I did it for the bartenders and the community that I usually taste with. I mean, on a busy day, I might even have a supplier with me. So I would have someone from a distillery being along with me. We're going to accounts, we're going to bars and restaurants, and we're essentially presenting to the buyers, and we'll maybe hit 10 accounts in a day and go out for a drink afterwards and get a bite to eat. We need it at that point. So during the pandemic, I kind of did that like online, and I invited anyone to kind of join on an education or simply have a pour of whiskey with me, and just chatted and kind of talked about the state of the world over.
Why don't you put your email into the chat, and then also when I forward your cookbook, your cocktail book tomorrow to everyone who registered for this, I'll also include your email, your contact information, so people can reach out to you.
Sure, that sounds great. I'll put a link to, I don't know if it'll link to my website, but you can kind of get an idea of the other products that I also work with and represent. Impex is obviously one of the big ones, which is the world whiskey that this belongs to. I work with another importer called Glass Revolution. They bring the Indian single malts, English whiskey to the US, a variety of vermouths and cognacs from Spain and from France. And then I've got a big Mexican portfolio as well. So on the middle shelf, you'll see like all mezcal and tequila and sotol and raicilla. All of that is, I represent that as well. So yeah, if there's anything else, I know we are about through. It was 7 to 8, right? So
Yeah.
Well, if anyone else has some a parting shot, if they will, please.
And if anyone has a request for a specific region or type of spirit that you would like another talk like this on, send me an email, and I would be happy to put that together for us on the JCC program here. For those,
Yeah, bourbon would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, I work with some bourbons as well. That's a fun one because you can go a lot of different directions with the conversation.
Yeah. Who do you work with bourbon wise?
So I work with Dave Schmier. Dave Schmier is the gentleman that built Redemption Rye.
Yep.
Which is an amazing. He then basically, after he parted with, he essentially sold Redemption to a Deutsch company, and then he took all of the proceeds from that and just immediately started acquiring barrels and putting them away. So now he's got rye whiskeys he's got straight rye releases of 6 years. He's got table whiskeys, as he describes, that are called the Deadwood whiskeys. But yeah, it's like MGP whiskeys. And then I have a couple other whiskeys that I'm happy to share, like St. Cloud Bourbon. I worked with Ray Walker, who launched that brand. I've worked with Wiggle Whiskey up in Pennsylvania. Some fun stuff. American Spirit Works in Atlanta. A lot. But my email's there if you want to talk deeper on anything and schedule something. Let's go.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and thank you, Phil. This was a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm
Simon.
so glad that y'all joined us. This was a lot of fun.
And Sims, what are we eating tonight, bud?
Yeah.
I'm making a pasta with fresh pasta from Pizza Delicious.
Oh,
Nice.
nice.
Pasta with
Yeah.
veggies. I don't think I was actually aware that everybody could see me, so my apologies.
You hosted a cooking show also.
Yeah,
You have a shirt on. Not sure if you're in your families, but
next time Phil and I can be in the same room, we can do 2 for 1.
sure.
Yeah, presentation.
I
That's
love it.
That sounds great.
Bill,
Well-
I just wanted to add, this is Harlan. I just wanted to say that you did a great job, and thanks to everybody that put this together. And the reason I wanted to chime in is just to let you know that I have the M&H Classic here, and my first time having it, and it's really delicious. And the more, I've had 1 glass during the course of this presentation, and from the beginning of it till the end, in terms of my glass, I just started to like it more and more throughout the experience. So I just want to share that feedback with you. It's really great. Thank you.
That's great. The whiskey is constantly evolving, from simply the glass to the pour, and then your palate, and, everything that happens in your brain when you taste it, and then you go back and you revisit it. That's an amazing part of tasting and drinking whiskey.
And what's also interesting is I have a bottle of the Indian whiskey as well, the Amrit.
Yeah.
And I prefer actually the classic, and I got a bottle of the sherry as well, but I prefer the classic M&H over the classic Amrit.
Yeah, they're both special. I mean, Amrut is got a bit more depth to it.
Yep.
In terms of like their core expression. It can be a bit more pungent on the nose as well, not in like a negative way, but it does have quite a bit more aromatics, but it does have like that similar nutty honey-like quality about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
It's just lighter and kind of a bit more palatable to more of a diverse audience of whiskey consumers. But great notes. I love both of these whiskeys. So, well, folks, I gotta get cooking.
All right.
I got some food I need to cook for dinner.
Thank you again. This
Thank
was
you.
really wonderful.
Great job.
Please let me know what you'd like to see moving forward. I'm sure Rachel can field a lot of those emails, and maybe we'll get a consensus of what the next project is. And feel free to reach out to me personally as well. I'd love to just chat, talk spirits. That's what I do in this community. So I'm happy to help if you need any guidance on what bottle you should pick up next.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right.
Thanks,
Thanks, guys. Have a great night.
Yeah, take care.
All right.